Okay, it's time to create our first interactions in the browser using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. I want to clarify that this process we're going through is sort of an opinionated one. It's one that I've come up with as I feel like this is the most straightforward way to learn how to do interactive development. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the most efficient way to code, but it's sort of the least abstract. As you become more familiar with JavaScript, you might sort of understand as the semester goes on, oh, I can think of some maybe more efficient ways to write this code. But I'm trying to start with a way that I think is the most clear to start with. Okay, so how do we start with this? The first thing we want to do is think about writing functions. A function is a reusable block of code. We looked at how to declare variables before with the keywords let and const. Here we're going to use the keyword function. Anything that goes into the definition of your function will be surrounded by curly brackets. And there's actually two steps to using functions. You have to define it, and then you have to call the function. In our readings, I used the example of, let's say you wanted to make, I think it was like spaghetti and meatballs for dinner, and there's lots of steps involved in that. And if what you want to do is, if you want to save some time, you could maybe teach someone else how to make the sauce, for example. And what the nice thing about that is you teach them how to do it once, and then that means in the future, all you have to do is say, hey, can you please make the sauce? And they don't need you to show them every single time. They've learned it from you once, and they can just do it on their own. So let's start by creating a function called make sauce. There are parentheses that go after the name of the function, and then we put our curly brackets. So what do we want to happen when we make sauce? We want to, first of all, we're just going to log stuff to the console for now. We're going to first chop stuff. That's step one of making sauce. We're going to saute and simmer. So let's say I want to get my fancy, oh, wrong one. I wanted to put the accent on there. You know what? I'm going to skip the accent because it might actually not work in the console. Saute and simmer. And then the last step is season to taste. Oops, I missed my period there. Console.log. Season to taste. All right. You know, one thing I want to mention too, I think I brought it up in an announcement for the class, but I kind of forgot to put my semicolons here. I got in the habit of not using them last year, and I've kind of gone back to using them again. If you forget to do stuff like that, or you space things a little bit incorrectly, like maybe I have a space before my parentheses but not before my curly brackets, you can do a couple things here. You can either go to your account preferences, your account settings, and go into the preferences and choose the format on save option. And so every time you save, it will reformat your code. Or you can just go to this little drop-down arrow here and say format JavaScript. There we go. So I need to get back in the habit of using semicolons, but I'm not too worried because I can always save or format and it'll put them in there for me. All right, so I've defined what happens in the function, but I haven't actually called it. Notice in the console, let me clear it, it's not saying chop stuff or saute and simmer or season to taste. What I need to do now is say, all right, I've given you the instructions, now do it. That will call the function. And notice it did all three things. It did them as separate steps. I've put multiple steps into one function so that a chunk of stuff can happen all at one time. So functions are really great because you can write a function that does a series of steps that maybe you need to reuse that function several times. That's one reason to write a function, is that, hey, I don't have to write this whole block of stuff every time. I can now just say make sauce, and it'll do multiple things with that one instruction. Okay, so we are going to use functions so that they can be called by event listeners. An event is a signal from the browser that something has happened. There's all kinds of events. Events can be triggered by a page load. Events can be triggered by scrolling. We're only going to focus on a few events throughout this semester. One way that events can be triggered is by an input. If I click a button, that triggers an event. If I move a slider, that triggers an event. If I type into an empty text box, that triggers an event. So since there are events, we can listen for those events. We can create an event listener and have it run a function when the event occurs. So let's start with sort of the most basic example. We're going to create a button. I'm saying basic because I think probably the most basic interaction is a click, right? So what do you do with buttons? You click them. I've created a button and I already have this function here. So why don't we reuse it for now? And what I need to do, so we talked about basic data types previously in the variables video about numbers and strings and Booleans. There is another data type that we're going to use, which is an HTML element. I can create a variable, we'll call it my button, that references the button in the HTML. So, whoops. We're going to do that with document.getElementById. And then in parentheses, what's the ID of that button? It doesn't have an ID. We haven't given it one yet. So you're using classes to do styling for the most part, hopefully. But IDs, try not to use them for styling. Use them only for JavaScript. Just kind of separate those concerns in your head. It makes it easier to be like more consistent with your code. So I'm going to give it the ID of my button. And notice something here. I wrote the variable name using camel case, lowercase m to start, uppercase button. So every a second or third or however many words there are in your variable, each one after the first is capitalized. But the way that I wrote my ID was with a hyphen in the middle. This is kebab case. So everything in HTML should be created in kebab case. Everything in JavaScript, unless you're referring to, like I'm referring to this ID that I wrote up here, but all the new stuff, anything I declare in JavaScript, like variable names and function names, should be camel case. So I've got something that's referencing that button. And this is when I mentioned, like, we're going to get sort of I'm going to be opinionated about this process. That's step one of this three-step process. Declare a variable to reference the input. I just made a variable that references the button. Step two, write a function that defines what should happen when the interaction occurs. I just want it to make sauce right now when I click the button, and I've already written that function. That's right here. So step three then is to actually add the event listener. When you write an event listener, you need to know two things. What kind of event is it listening for? And what's the name of the function that it's going to call? We already know that second part. We already have a function called makeSauce. The first part, what kind of event is it listening for? Well, it's a button. What do you do to a button? You click on it. So my button is going to have an event listener added to it with add event listener. And then in parentheses, the first thing is, what's the event you're listening for? The second thing is, what is the name of the function? Notice that click, the event, is in quotation marks. Make sauce, the function, is not. I don't have a great way to explain why that's the case, except to say that the event it's expecting it wants a string, and the second part, the function, it's not a string. It's the name of a function. Sorry, I don't have a better way to explain what it is, but just remember that events get passed in with quotation marks. The functions get called without them. So what do we expect to happen now? When I click the button, then in the console, it should say those three things. Click. Hey, it works. Great. Let's go a step further here. I want to talk about this thing called class toggling. I think a lot of the interactive stuff that you're going to do in your projects can be accomplished with class toggling. To me, it's a very, I don't want to say organized, it's a utilitarian way, let's say, to change the visual state of things. So let's say this button here, what I want to happen is that when I click the button, it alternates between being red and let's say red and green. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to style my button with, we're going to start with appearance none. What that does is it removes the default styling of the browser. Notice how it doesn't have a rounded edges anymore. In a way, it's gotten uglier, but that means that we can be a little bit more deliberate about how we're going to style it. Let's give it a default background color of red. And remember, red, if you want, you can use RGB. I'm going to use hex codes because I know that the first 2 digits are red, the next 2 are green, the next 2 are blue. There we go. So it's going to start as red. There we go. Background color of red. Let's make the font larger so it's easier to see. Whoops. I don't know. Need my property first. Font size 2 rem. There we go. Let's add a little padding so it looks nicer. 1 character of padding. And let's also add a border radius so that it's rounded again like it was initially. Border radiuses are one of the few cases where I think pixels are the best unit to use. Let's actually remove the border as well because it kind of has this weird, it looks like 1990s era 3D interface design. I don't like that. So I'm just going to say border none. There we go. Great. So we just have a solid red button with a nice rounded corners like we had before. So if I click the button now, it still just does the same thing as before, which is log my messages to the console. And again, what I want to do is I want to toggle it between red and green. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a second class that says, what do you want to change about this button when it's in this second state? We'll call it active because it's sort of like, I'm going to think about this as like it's currently inactive. When I click it, it becomes active. And I wanted to just change the background color. And we're going to make that green. So again, hex codes, first 2 digits are red, then green, then blue. I haven't applied that class to the button yet, so it looks exactly the same. If you want to just check and see what does this look like when I have this active class on there, just type it in manually. It turns green, right? This class, because it's later in our CSS definition, is superseding the background color declared up here. So because we've specifically given it a class and I manually typed it in here, we can see, okay, that's what it's going to look like after I click. That's my goal. So let's get rid of this. All right, it's back to red. So now down here, what I want my function to do, let's get rid of all this console.log stuff. Let's change the name of the function because it's going to do something different now. What it's going to do is toggle button color. Okay, to do that then, I've already created a variable that references the button itself. I can use that. I can say my button dot class list dot toggle. So the nice thing about class list dot toggle is you don't have to keep track of, do I need to add it now or do I need to remove it now? It just automatically does that for you. If it's currently got that class, it will remove it. If it doesn't have that class, then it'll add it. It'll just make sure that it alternates between those 2 states. And that class name that I want to add is active. Let me format it because I'm forgetting semicolons again. There we go. Okay. So if I click the button, it is not turning green. Why not? Let's see what's going on here. Class list. Oh, because look what I did. I forgot to, remember I changed the name of my function. I forgot to replace the old name of the function up here. So that's why nothing was happening. Now if I click it, there we go. It turns green, it turns red. If I open the developer tools, I can see when I clear out all these old, by the way, you can clear, where's that clear button? Nope, that's the close button. Where's the clear console button? Oh, here we go, the trash icon. Sorry about that. Okay, so I cleared out my console just so I don't have to see all that mess anymore. That's not even really what I want to look at. I want to look at the inspector. and I want to look at this button. Okay, so pay close attention to the inspector there. When I click it, see how it actually, it added that class active. If I click it again, it removes it. That's what's happening here when classlist.toggle runs. If I add a transition time to the button, we'll see that happen gradually instead of immediately. The color changes gradually. So any of those style properties that are being changed are happening using that transition time. All right, so I want to do two more things here with this button. The first thing I want to do is have it so that when I click the button, it changes something else. So I need to have something else in my HTML. Let's just make a p tag called, I need to give it an ID because it will need a variable. ID is text warning. Danger, danger, danger. Feels like danger should be showing when it's red, right? Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So let's say it's the red button is telling us, hey, there's danger. You need to click me to reset. I don't know. I'm just making some stupid stuff up, right? Okay. So now what that means is that when I click the button, when it turns green, it also needs to make text warning disappear. So let's do that with, let's see, down here in toggle button color, I need to say, I'm declaring a new variable for text warning, document.getElementById. Okay, and I'm going to do the same thing, text warning. What should we, I guess we didn't make a class yet for this. We'll call this class cleared message. How about? Okay, so what this means is when I click the button, it's going to toggle the active class on to the button itself, which makes it green, and then it's going to also toggle this cleared message class. I need to make that cleared message, and we'll just make it opacity. Opacity is 0. Okay, so when it adds this cleared message class to my warning, it's going to become completely transparent, which it has the effect of making it disappear, right? I don't have a transition time on that because I would need to, I can do that really quickly if I just say with my P selector, I'll just say transition 1s so that it also gradually fades away. There we go. Okay, so I've got that button. Clicking it triggers an event. The event listener changes not only the original thing that I clicked, but also something else. I can refer to them both with variables. The last thing I want to do here is really kind of related to your first project, the FAQ. If you click a button, I want there to be some kind of indicator in there that shows whether it's in the closed or open state. And by indicator, you've seen stuff like this before. Let's say I make a, if I had like an X button, let's put this in a span element, sorry, not an X, a plus. There we go. So sometimes you'll see in something like an FAQ or some kind of site where you're looking for support information or something, you click a button to open a message and there's some sort of indicator that it shows like it's a plus, letting you know, hey, there's a message here that isn't showing, and then it'll turn to be an X to let you know, okay, now that it's open, you can click me to close. It's showing you like the function of the button has changed. It's gone from opening a message to now closing a message. Now I put a plus sign in there really quickly just to see kind of what I'm talking about here, but I'm actually going to go and get an icon from Google Icons instead. The reason for that is because things like rotation and other sort of transformations don't work on text characters. So I want to go get an actual, basically an actual image for this. And it's really easy to add one from Google Icons. So let's look for a plus icon. There we go, they're add. And they show you here how to add it. We're gonna look for this static icon font on the bottom is an easier way. So I have a part of this link tag has to go in my HTML. And then my, here we go, inserting the icon, you create this span element. So I'm going to replace what I had with my plus here. Save. Great. So it kind of looks the same, right? The only difference really is that it's no longer, the plus button was kind of sitting farther down, I think. Now it's sort of more centered in the middle of the button, which is nice. All right. I'm looking at this because I want to show you that when something has an active class added to it, remember this active class is being added to my button to turn it green. I also want to say there's something inside of that button that I also want to change when it's active. This is one thing that I think is really useful about CSS nesting. When the button has the active class, I want the span that's inside of it to rotate, and we're going to do by minus 45 degrees, because that will basically turn it into an X. There we go. And again, if you want some a transition time on that, we'll actually have to, we've kind of got a multiple selectors here going on. Let's see if it, let me see if, no, it won't, sorry, it won't work if you put it on the class that's being toggled, because that means you're adding and removing the transition time, and the transition time has to always be on the element. So just to be quick about it, look, there's already a class. Let's grab this class here and just use the same one. It's a little bit long, but we'll say it has a transition of 1 second. So all three of our elements now that are changing, our button and our message and our plus sign, they all have transition durations. There we go. So this CSS here, it's a little bit messy. I think if I were to clean it up, what I probably would do is, let's say that, okay, let's move our transition time that's applied to the icon. Let's actually move that here inside of the button selector with our nested CSS and say, hey, there's a span inside of you. I want that to transition too. This active class looks pretty good. That's basically everything that I want to happen with that active class. And I think this is probably as good as I can get. I'm adding a transition to the P tag because this is a whole separate element, right? It's not inside the button, so I don't know that I could clean that up any better than that. You might also want to get used to using comments to sort of separate out different sections of your code and help you organize stuff. So everything below this line is related to the message, this part here. And let me just copy that and say, this is the, oh, actually, no, this is all related to each other, the button and then the active state of the button. And then we've got our P tag and then our cleared state of the P tag. Boop, boop. The examples in the reading are very similar to this, so take a look at those, and good luck with that. This is a really, really important sort of, the stuff in here, basically all of this is what you want to use towards project one, towards the FAQ. Event listeners, functions, variables, there's sort of a list of things. Oh, let me show you one more thing. Instead of making this message just fade out like that, what if I had something below that message? Let's just make another button down there. Now, when you have a second button, you have to be careful because IDs should only be used one time. Notice if I click this, that's still working, but the second button has the same ID and it's not working. It's going to get, your JavaScript is going to get confused when multiple things have the same ID. So when it comes to creating separate interactive elements, you want to make sure that each one has its own ID. So I'm going to make this one my button 1, this one my button 2, and make sure that I reflect those changes down here in my JavaScript, my button 1 for my variable name. And in the event, like as soon as you change the name here, it means it's got to be changed everywhere else too. I think that does it. Let's see. Great. Okay, it still works. So notice when that p tag message disappears, these buttons are still the same distance apart. Because remember, we just made it transparent. We didn't actually make it go away. It's still taking up space. So what's a way I could make this go away instead? What if I changed the height instead of changing the opacity here? So let's say that it goes to a height of 0 when I click. It kind of works. Why is it still, those two buttons are still really far apart? Hey, remember that p tags have some padding by default. See how when I use my inspector, I hover, there's that yellow space above and below. It's got some padding. When I click and make it go away, that padding is still there. There we go. That padding is still there. So it's taking up some space even though I've told it to have a height of 0. So I need to also get rid of the padding. This wouldn't be an issue if I had used a div or something like that instead, but that just means that I need to say that my p tags also need to have 0 padding, or is it, I'm sorry, maybe it's actually margin. It's actually margin. I did my colors backwards. It's yellow for margin, and there we go. Okay. So now that works kind of like what I want, but there's a little bit of an issue, which is that it doesn't transition. The reason for that is because we never specified an initial height. We've only specified a closed height. So what I'm going to do, it needs a value to transition to and from, and we only gave it a transition value to transition to, but not from. So I'm going to say that it has a max height of 2 rem. I'm just kind of making that value up right now. I can adjust that if it's not quite right. Now when I click, it still isn't. I think I have to say max height for both. That makes sense, right? They both should be max height. There we go. Okay, one more thing here. It's kind of hard to see, but if I didn't have a background color on my second button, I think we would see it. You can just barely make out. Let me try zooming. Can I zoom in? No, I can't zoom in. Oh yeah, there we go. You can just, oh, I lost my, there we go. Are you still working? Great. You can just make out a little bit of see how there's just a little bit of the D there sticking out? The button is covering it up, but that's because even though the height of the p tag has been reduced to 0, text is always going to want to spill out. Think of it kind of like if you've ever used a spreadsheet before and you're typing something in a cell and the text doesn't fit, it'll just keep spilling out the right side. And that's kind of what's happening here. So I also want to add to my p tag an overflow hidden. And that just means that if there's no room for text, don't let it spill out. Now, that little tiny bit of the D that was sticking out is gone. So it completely hides it. Okay. There we are. Hope that's helpful. See you on the next one.